Click the subscribe button, hit the bell icon to never miss another update.
An important aspect of religion to understand the characteristics of enemies of Ahlulbayt Enemies, so we can avoid adapting these in our daily lives. This is real Tabarra. Today, we are going to learn about one of the worst enemies of Ahlulbayt Enemies, Yazid. Yazid was the wicked son of Muawiyah who inherited his father's rule. He was the second of the dynastic rulers at the beginning of the Islamic era. His father, Muawiyah, had obtained power over the Muslim community through deceit and treachery. During the last days of his reign, he made the people pledge their support for his son Yazid. Thereupon, he installed him as his successor at an official ceremony. Yazid's mother was Maysoon, who, like Hind, notorious for having eaten the liver of Hamza, was an impure and unchaste woman. Yazid, who was supposed to be the son of Muawiyah, was really the offspring of a slave. This has been confirmed by the noble Prophet ﷺ, who said, "The murderer of my son, Hussein ﷺ, is a bastard," which also applies to Shimr ibn Sa'd and ibn Ziyad, since all of them were born out of wedlock. Yazid had inherited all the qualities of his character and way of behaving from his father Muawiyah. All that is, except for one thing. Whereas Muawiyah, governed by trickery and deceit, compromised with the demands of Islam even to the point of building mosques. Yazid, however, shamelessly committed the most criminal and despicable acts. Throughout his life, and especially during his period of rule, this tyrant, who reigned over the unfortunate, unaware Muslims in the name of Islam, became notorious for the following. 1. He owned monkeys which would dance for him dressed in gold-embroidered, multicolored clothes. 2. His racing dogs were renowned the world over. 3. He was passionately fond of gambling. 4. His addiction to wine set a clear example of his successors. 5. He acted disrespectfully towards the Haram, mosque of the Prophet, and towards other mosques of the Muslims. 6. He killed the offspring of the Messenger of Allah and committed numerous other crimes at the tragedy of Karbala. 7. He forced the women folk to take off their veils from both the Muhajirun, that is, those who left Mecca for Medina, and also from amongst the Ansar, that is, those already living in Mecca. 8. He killed countless people of Medina. 9. He arrested and made prisoners the supporters of Ali alayhi salam. 10. He was responsible for damaging the house of Kaaba and its embroidered covering. 11. He committed many other despicable crimes which are at least as famous as those we have listed. Yazid was the first person who made corruption, wine drinking, music, and dancing commonplace behavior within the Muslim lands. Yazid, in fact, was a man who devoted his life to wine drinking, luxury, indulgence, racing dogs, and gambling. It was Yazid, the so-called caliph of the Muslims, who killed the offspring of the Messenger of Allah and their faithful supporters. Immediately after killing Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it was this same man who sat back to repose in front of a feast of food and wine, surrounded by musicians, singers, and wine pourers. Yazid, like his father had done before him, deliberately and openly changed the divine laws to suit his own wishes. He committed such despicable acts during his rule, which lasted only 3 years and 9 months, that he has been cursed by Allah and the people until the end of time. The most abominable of these was the murdering of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, his family, and a group of his supporters during the first year of his rule. He set fire to their tents, tortured the women and baby children, and rode over the body of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and others who had died fighting in Allah's way, shahada on horseback. Moreover, in the second year of his rule, an event known as Harra took place, which was the scene of further bloody atrocities on his part. Like Muawiyah and his bloodthirsty agents, Yazid and his corrupt followers did not shun any criminal act, however disgusting or tyrannical. It was this event which clearly demonstrated to the Muslims and to all men world over the extent of his corruption and violation of the most basic of human rights. A group of men from Medina, like others of that time who were forced at spear point or bribed to make a pledge to Yazid, made their way to visit this so-called Muslim ruler at his place of government in Syria, or more accurately Sham, a country which roughly corresponds to present-day Syria and parts of Lebanon and Palestine. They were able to see with their own eyes what kind of man was the man who was ruling as a caliph of Islam, namely a man who loved wine, racing dogs, gambling, and a life of ease and luxury, and shamelessly violated the honor of men, women, and children alike. They returned to Medina in a state of profound unease. When they had told the people of the situation, a large group of men gathered and rose in defiance of the murderous regime. They expelled the governor of Yazid and his wicked and bloodthirsty agents from Medina. From this moment onwards, the ranks of those rebellious to the government of Yazid grew larger day by day. Cries of death to Yazid and his corruption rang out all around Medina. People spoke out for Islam from the platform minbar of the mosques, from the streets and squares, and whenever people would gather together, they courageously declared their opposition to Yazid, saying, "Anyone who has killed the progeny of the Messenger of Allah, anyone who drinks wine, does not fast or pray, is addicted to gambling and racing dogs, anyone who indulges in luxurious living, dancing, and music, anyone who rules corruptly, thinking only of his own interests and never of the poor, deprived people, such a man has no right to such a position of power and authority over the Muslims. Such a man must step down from his position and make way for another man. We Muslims of Medina have pledged our allegiance to a man called Abdullah bin Hanzala, who is often called Ghasil al-Malaika. We cannot bear to live under the tyranny and corruption of the drunkard Yazid and his agents." News of this rebellion of the Muslims of Medina reached Yazid's ears. Yazid ordered his hated agents to go as soon as possible to the scene of the demonstrations. They were to quell the demonstrators and to stop the cry of those seeking truth and justice from reaching the ears of the rest of the Muslims. The bloodthirsty Yazid had a man called Muslim bin Uqba, also known as Mushrif, the wanton spendthrift, brought before him. The latter had been a faithful friend of Yazid's father Muawiyah. He dispatched Muslim bin Uqba at the head of a large army to crush the rebellious Muslims in Medina. After marching for some time, they came to a halt in the rocky area near Medina known as Harra. The people of Medina set off towards them in order to defend their lives and honor. In this place known as Harra, a heavy battle took place between the armies of truth and falsehood. Many of the Muslims from Medina were killed. The rest were forced to retire, unable to withstand the sheer size and weaponry of this murderous army of Yazid. They took refuge in mosques, including the Holy Prophet's mosques, in order to save their lives. It was the custom in those days to respect the sanctity of mosques, the haram of the Prophet, and large cemeteries. Anyone taking refuge then would be safe from any harm. The people of Medina, under the impression that even the armies of the usurper Caliph Yazid would respect this custom, took refuge in these places. They did not realize that these were the same godless people who had molested the Prophet, breaking his teeth, throwing dirt on his face, and committing countless other despicable acts. They were the same people who, while claiming to be Muslims, placed Ali alayhi salam under house arrest, killed his sons, and tortured his faithful supporters. It was these same ignorant people who, in the name of the Quran and claiming to defend the rights of every Muslim, disregarded the divine commandments and made corruption a commonplace in the society of the day. Muslim and Uqba, the commander of this army of bloodthirsty men, entered the mosques and the haram, sanctuary of the noble Prophet, on horseback in search of those who had sought refuge there. In total violation of the ancient custom, they put everyone to the sword. The mosque and the haram of the noble messenger were drenched in blood. Those godless mercenaries acted as they wished, desecrating and ruining the sanctuaries of Islam. They then attacked Medina itself, killing countless inhabitants and violating the honor and property of others. Even women, youths, and young children were not spared the slaughter. The murderous commander, acting as his master Yazid, would have then allowed his army the total freedom of the city for 3 days. Taking advantage of this permission, Yazid's mercenaries gave free rein to their base animal-like instincts. These savage, godless men, acting in accordance with the saying, "The way the common people live is dictated by the behavior of their kings," imitated the behavior of Yazid. Following the example of their savage, tyrant king, they subjected those who had fled to the mosque to unspeakable atrocities. After the army commander and his vicious mercenaries had subdued the rebellion of the Muslims by their slaughter of the inhabitants of Medina, they forced those who survived the attack to make a pledge of allegiance to Yazid. After exacting this pledge under the threat of death, they continued and increased their reign of terror. A group of the surviving Muslims, fearful for their lives and property, swore an oath of allegiance to Yazid. Others, however, who resisted and refused to accept dictatorial tyranny of Yazid, were killed by the savage mercenaries. Such was the reality of what took place at Hara, just one atrocity among the thousands committed by Yazid in the name of Islam and as so-called Muslim ruler. Another of the despicable acts Yazid became notorious for was his destruction and setting fire to mosques. Abdullah bin Zubair was one of the rebellious Muslims whose independence and determination to secure a true Muslim government caused Yazid considerable trouble. The latter, in order to destroy Abdullah bin Zubair and his supporters, sent an army commanded by Hasan bin Numair to Mecca. The army marched towards Mecca and came to a halt in the hills overlooking the area of the Kaaba. They then began to hurl great boulders and fiery missiles from their huge catapults on to the house of the Kaaba, destroying its walls completely and setting on fire the wooden part of the structure, embroidered drape covering. Then the barbaric mercenaries of the tyrant Yazid began to attack the town itself with missiles, staffs, cudgels, and sword killing and plundering the inhabitants of Mecca. The people of Mecca were in desperate situation. There was no way open to them but to entrust their faith to Allah and raise their hands in prayer to plead for the death of Yazid. They prayed that Allah may deliver them of this corrupt dictator who was responsible for all the killing and tyranny. It was not long before news reached Mecca of the death of Yazid. The commander of the army and his army of brutal mercenaries returned to Sham, and as a result, the defenseless people of Mecca were delivered of the merciless attackers. After 3 years, 9 months, and 22 days of dictatorial government, Yazid left this world. He died of a kind pleurisy, a serious illness with inflammation of the delicate membrane of the thorax and the lungs, marked by pain in the chest or sides. His grave became a dirty rubbish dump, a fitting and for such tyrant, a fitting end for a man who violated the honor and property of the Muslims, a fitting end for anyone who allows his satanic desires to take precedence over the laws and commandments of Islam.